Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today we're going to talk about 3 ways that you can use quilt panels in your quilty projects. And some of them, they look like panels, and some of them they 100% do not. But I know sometimes we love them, we fall in love with the way they look, but then we're like, but now what? What do I do with this? And sometimes there are patterns that are made specifically for panels, and sometimes they're kind of a weird size and you have to wing it and do your own. So we're going to talk about that today. So first, let's talk about what is a quilt panel, just in case you never have known this before. So a lot of times a quilt panel is going to look like this one here, where it's roughly 24 inches from the place where you cut it to the side. This one actually has dotted lines on it to show where we are supposed to cut it here at the store. And so it probably actually is about 23 inches once we measure in to where the artwork is. And a lot of times the design goes completely from one selvage to the next. So that makes it really easy for the fabric manufacturers to make this, because essentially it's 2/3 of a yard wide. Occasionally I have seen ones that are a full yard wide, but that's pretty rare. Usually they're going to be 24 inches, but again, you're not always able to use the full 24 inches because sometimes there's a little bit of white on the edges like this. And usually you can get at least 42 inches from selvage to selvage. In this one, it goes almost all the way to the selvage, so you're definitely going to get that here. But oftentimes there are these really gorgeous designs. Like this is a digitally printed painting that the fabric designer Stephanie Brandenburg did that has been turned into fabric. So this is the most common type of panel you're gonna see, but there are others too. So this is another type of panel you might see. It's still 24 inches wide. It still has those dotted lines for us to cut on here at the quilt shop, but instead of having one big design that runs from selvage to selvage, it has a background and then it has designs on the inside. Like this one here, it's probably about 10 inches or so wide. It is important to note though that even though sometimes these are printed to look like squares, it's not the same as having a woven piece of fabric. They may look square, but when you cut them and try and fussy cut them, they may not be straight. Or in this case, it's not supposed to be, and sometimes they're just not printed as straight as we would like. But in this case, we have 8 sort of little designs in here that could make really good block centers, or you could just still use it all as one piece and put things around it. But you also can cut them out and use them, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. There are also other panel designs that have even more things going on in them. Sometimes there's different sections to cut out that you could maybe use as like a throw pillow or something. But these are the 2 most common types you're going to see. Ones where it runs completely the design from selvage to selvage and gives you this beautiful portrait of something, and ones where you have smaller squares on the inside that you could maybe use as a block. In almost all the cases, they're going to be designed to be cut at every 24 inches, but you might not have 24 inches of usable width when you're working with your panel and actually using it in a quilt, because some of them will have white lines in between, like on this one. All right, so now we're going to get into how we could actually use these in a quilt. So I pulled this quilt off my daughter's bed this morning to use specifically in this video because it's a really easy way to use a panel. In this case, I was at a quilt show with my daughter, who was a little baby at the time, and I saw this fat quarter bundle and I thought it looked adorable. Like the colors were fabulous for a little girl, and I've got a big thing for owls, so it really worked for both of us. And then it also had this really great striped fabric that went with it. So what I did was I bought my fat quarter bundle, and then I bought probably 2-3 yards of this fabric as well, knowing that I was going to do a mitered border, so that way I could tie it in. So that's kind of what you want to look for. So you say you see something you like, and you know you want to do something with it. Get a lot of times, like, you know, the bundle that we looked at earlier, that panel, that was the gorgeous painted tree. This is a fat quarter bundle that also includes the panel. So step number 1, buy the coordinating prints that go with it, and then maybe add on 2-3 yards to also give you enough for a border and binding. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to actually measure your panel. So this quilt is about 8 years old. It's been washed a time or two. So it's definitely shrunk some. But in this case, my usable width of my panel is 18 inches. What I did was I designed an 11-inch block to go with this specifically. Now, not everyone is going to want to go design a block. An 11-inch finished block is a weird size. But what I would recommend is actually going to a multiple of 12. So when I measure my usable distance here, it is exactly 23 inches from the edge of where the painting starts to here. Now, I'm a very accurate stitcher, but even I would not just cut this a 1/4 inch on either side and hope that I don't see white. What I would do is I would pull it down and trim this up so that way I was at 22.5 inches instead. That way I've got a little bit of wiggle room. I've got this lined up now, so 22.5 is centered. So that basically is going to allow me to cut right on the edge of where the color is. And then once everything is said and done and sewn up, this is going to measure 22 inches wide once all my seam allowances are tucked on the inside of that quilt. So if I want to pair this with being able to put blocks around it that are 12 inches finished, then that means that I need to add a total of 2 inches of border on the sides of this. If I'm at 22 inches, once my seam allowances are accounted for, then that means I need to add 1 inch to both sides with our finished size. Now, because the finished side does not include our 1/4 inch seam allowances, that means I need 2 1.5 inch borders on either side. So that way, when everything is said and done, we have a 1 inch border finished, a 22 inch panel finished, and a 1 inch border finished. And then we're gonna fit to have blocks on top. So basically, pick any 12-inch block you want and then add enough borders to where it ends up being 24.5 inches wide, and then it will fit with your 12.5-inch blocks before they get sewn together. Same thing for the top and bottom. So like I said, most of the time you can get 42 inches out of that usable. Well, you need to get to 48 inches if you want to be able to put 4 blocks on the side. So if you're going to do that, then that means that we need to add 3-inch borders on top. So I did a whole bunch of roundabout math for it, but basically, if I want this to fit with 2 blocks on top that finish at 12 inches, 4 blocks on the side that finish at 12 inches, then basically I need a 1-inch border on either side. So we're going to cut it to 1.5 and sew it to the sides, and then it will finish at 1 inch once everything is sewn together. And then on the top and bottom, I need 2 3.5-inch borders that will finish at 3 inches and eventually give me that extra 6 inches I'm missing so that I can fit 4 blocks on the side. And that means we need a total of 16 blocks. Pretty easy peasy. I remember when I did this original quilt, I had the top together the same weekend I bought the fabric. So it can really go very fast that way. Then if you want to add a border, you can. No big deal, but it's totally up to you. So we'll take some photos of this too, but we're just going to take a peek at it one more time just so that you can see what I did here. We've got our panel in the center. We have a skinny border up top and a larger one on the side so that it would fit my blocks. So in this case, I have 2 on the top, and then of course we have some in our corners. And then for this one, I've got 3 blocks going down the sides for this one because that's just how it worked for that math. And then I had my pieces on the end here. And, you know, I'm a quilt pattern designer. I'm used to figuring stuff out. This was before I did this, like all the time. But it was just a really fun way to do it. I kind of did like a modified log cabin where we got a 4-patch and then we just added some pieces on the side to make use of all of our fabrics in there. But you can just pick any block that finishes 12 inches. And then as long as you get that border or that center with your borders on it to be 2 by 4 feet plus a 1/2 inch on all sides for seam allowances, you're good to go. Then grab a couple of extra yards for your border and background and you're good to go. I actually think this part got cut from the fat quarter And then this part came from yardage that I saved to go with it. So it was a really fun one, really fast, really great way to have a really cute quilt very quickly. Here's another example of a quilt that I literally just pulled out of storage. It's been on timeout for I think 10 years because I tried to do feathers on it and failed pretty badly. I will show you my hideous feathers while we're doing this video. But you can see this one runs horizontally. But what I did was I put all around it and did it horizontally, and then I wanted my quilt to be square. So I added border to the side, border to the top, and in this case, there are the same size border, so it's nice and tidy. And then I added some fun blocks up top, and they kind of were mirror image, so like basically this block is reverse coloring from this one. So then I was able to fill it in, and by adding it, this is kind of where you have to keep the math in mind. So basically I added enough to this so that way I was able to fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks that are 9 inches wide so that it would be nice and even. So you have to kind of work backwards. You have to figure out what size block do I want to put on the top and bottom of this. And then that's how much you need to add to your border in order to get it to where you want to go. And then from there, I added more border to the side in order to make it a little bit bigger, make it lap quilt size. I think this is about 5 foot square. And then I attempted to quilt feathers, and it's a hot mess. That's what it is. It's so bad. It's terrible, and I did it on a non-stitch regulated machine, and so those stitches are so tiny that I have never in 10 years gone back to pick them out. I'll give you a close-up before we move on. So here we go. I went over this feather about 4 times, 5 times. Didn't once travel correctly. I'm not sure what's happening here. We have another travel fail over here, and this is a point where I just gave up because as you can see, we have feathers going in opposite directions. So that was where I was like, that's it. It is not my time to do feathers. And it has sat in storage for 10 years since. I literally just need to unpick and redo this border and I would be able to use this quilt. Have I done that? No, I've not. But maybe someday it will get out of timeout and be finished. All right, so I do not have the original of this quilt anymore, so we're gonna have to show you some images from when we did it before. We gave it to my niece at Christmas last year, but my daughter and I worked together to design a unicorn panel quilt. So we had a panel from Clothworks, which is very much like this one, where it had a total of 8 squares that were all different unicorns in them. And my daughter wanted to really showcase those. So what we did was I fussy cut all of the panels out into squares. So that way they could become the blocks. So you don't have to piece the block, you just have this. And then we took some coordinating fat quarters and half yards and we used those as other sections of the block. So what you ended up with was basically a fussy cut panel as your blocks, some coordinating yardage or fat quarters for the rest of them that look good on a big scale. And at the end of the day, we had a lap quilt that my then 8-year-old was able to sew together herself and that she designed. And because it's not piecing intensive, you're essentially using these designs as your blocks because they don't need to be cut up. They can stand on their own. You can get it done really quickly. So for that one, I believe it was a 10-inch finished block that we worked on for that. And it works really good when you have these particular types of panels. You can use those to showcase. And it's great because if you end up using a little bit of the outside, no big deal. It looks pretty. Like it's not like it's all white and gross. Like you can just like cut it up and let it be and it is what it is. And then you use your coordinating yardage. You get another fat quarter bundle to go with it. And maybe some extra fabric for a border. You're set. You're good to go. And you can have a lot of fun with that, and it can be a really good one to do with new sewers. The fussy cutting you might want to hand with, but the rest of it is pretty simple and easy to get together. So even though the pattern has the word unicorn in it, it absolutely works for all panels where you're dealing with this kind of situation where we can just cut it out and use it as the entire block without piecing it together. Now, speaking of fussy cutting, that is the last thing that I'm going to recommend that you do with a panel, and that is to just cut out your favorite parts and use them in quilts where you can use the fabric large, like this one. This is Lady's Chain, and I made it most recently in a Shell Rummel line where she came out with a panel, and in the panel were fabric versions of her watercolor prints that she designed and that her fabric designs come from. And so there were a bunch of different sizes within there. There were a couple of large ones, a couple of smaller ones, but they all worked really well for me to be able to cut the 6-inch pieces from and the 4-inch pieces from. So what I did was I still used my fat quarter bundle to go with it to add some more pieces to this, but I also fussy cut out my favorite parts from the panel. So I wasn't able to use everything, and the panel looked like Swiss cheese by the time I was done with it. But my favorite parts got to be placed at different areas within the quilt to really show off the art that I absolutely fall in love with and love from Shell Rummel. So this is another way to do it where you would not be able to tell if I didn't tell you that there is a panel within this quilt. But that allows you to show off your favorite features of it without it looking like a panel at the end of the day. Well, I hope you have enjoyed taking a peek at different ways that you can use panels in your quilts. I hope that this was helpful for you and gave you some good ideas on what you can do for your next quilt. And until next time, happy quilting.